Perfect. Welcome to our discussion today about presenting in political science. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Harold Jansen here to discuss his experiences with what many in our discipline know Harold for, which is very innovative approaches to not only teaching but also to presenting at conferences. And I know from first-hand experiences some folks that maybe not studying what Harold studies, but have actually flocked to his presentation just to see how he puts it all together. And he makes things entertaining and informative, which is one of the reasons why he's a teaching chair at the University of Lethbridge, but also, again, why he's known as an innovator when it comes to presenting. So I'll turn it over to you, Harold, and I'll mute my line over here to give you more bandwidth.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jared. Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about presentations, because what dawned on me going to a lot of presentations, and especially having been on the other side here when I became a professor here and sitting on job searches and sitting through people who wanted to get jobs here and sitting through their research presentations, was what struck me is that most people, the only impression they ever get from you is the research presentation. So if you are presenting at a conference, you get your little 15-minute presentation, sometimes as little as 10, and that's it. Most people are never going to read the paper. All they're ever going to see of you is those 10 or 15 minutes. That's actually a very scary thought when you think about it. So I started thinking about a little bit about this, and I also reflected on the hours of bad research presentations I've sat through and that I still sit through. And I've given my fair share of really bad research presentations. So that formed a lot of my experience here, is just starting to think very critically about the way we were doing things. This also came from, we always talk about how our research informs our teaching, but this also actually came out of thinking a little bit about my classrooms and how my teaching wasn't going the way I wanted it to do, and it was reflecting a little bit on the way that PowerPoint slides were ruining my teaching. So I did a bit of reading, I did a bit of research on this, and started thinking of some different ways to do it. So that's where this all came from, just some dissatisfaction with what I was seeing and more with what I was doing. Other people can do things the way they want to, but I wanted to do things in particular ways. So if we step back and think about what we want to accomplish in a presentation, there's really one key thing we want to do, and that's communication. In writing, we get a lot of practice in writing, and I was talking with Jared a little bit about this before we started. We get lots of practice in writing, and through your undergrad you write lots of papers, and you learn how to communicate clearly in writing, and for those of you in graduate school, you have presumably mastered that to a certain degree where you are able to write effectively. And so you learn things like the importance of a clear thesis statement, organization, proper grammar, all those proper technical things. You get lots of practice at that. In presenting, we're really doing the same thing. We're trying to communicate clearly. But here's the thing that I have come to realize. Presentations and writing they're different media. And too often, I know I have lots of presentations where I'd write the paper and then I'd fly off to, say, the Canadian Political Science Association conference. Let's say I get there on a Tuesday, I'm presenting on a Wednesday. Tuesday night, I would basically take notes on my paper, and that would be my presentation. I'd slap those notes up onto PowerPoint, and that would be it. That doesn't work very well. So you have to think about, to me, the presentation as a presentation. It's a different kind of thing, and I'll talk about that a little more in a second. The other thing that's really dawned on me is you need to know your audience. So you need to know, first of all, how specialized they are, and that's going to vary depending on basically who you've got coming. So I've done presentations here in Lethbridge. We have an organization that has a whole community that that people from the community can come and hear talks. I've done presentations to my department, to the whole university. I've done presentations to academic conferences, but even they vary, right? If I go to something like the Prairie Political Science Association, which tends not to be as specialized, I have to plan things a little differently than if I'm presenting at a more specialized section of, say, the Canadian Political Science Association. Say I'm just presenting to people who do political behavior, I can make more assumptions. Or if I'm at a very invitation-only conference where it's all people who focus on a particular kind of research. That's going to affect the assumptions you can make about what they understand, about data analysis, about the kinds of jargon and terminology you can use. So you need to think very, very carefully about your audience. Again, the goal is to communicate. You also have to think about culture and context. When you get to the point where you're presenting internationally, that's something I've really found. People out there don't know a lot about Canada, and why should we? Why should they? It's a pretty small place with I mean, I think it's interesting and a good place to live, but it's you have to explain things about the Canadian context. So I was once doing a paper presentation at the Elections, Public Opinion, and Party section of the British Political Science Association, and we make this big assumption that generally in Canada we expect MPs who are running for office to live in the constituency that they are running to represent, and that's not an assumption held in Britain. So you have to explain a lot of those things. So you need to think very carefully about your audience and how you're going to reach them. Don't assume that they know the same things that you do. Again, the goal is to communicate. Find out where they're at and how you communicate most effectively. Now here's a key thing that I've learned, is that the goal is to really about communicating and not showing how smart you are. That's hard. A lot of times you want to present people and blow them away with your dazzling vocabulary, your statistical prowess, but that's really not the goal. So I'm going to try something on Google Plus that I've not tried before, which is sharing my screen here. So I'm going to share this for a second. Oops. Okay, this is not working the way I wanted to. Go. Yeah, of course, when I try to do something new, and this is another lesson, I did this on purpose to demonstrate to you that you should always try your technology before you do it. So, can you see this slide? I hope you can. So, Albert Einstein once said everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So he made this really key point to me, which is that you need to try to communicate simply. Simplify things, make them as clear as possible, but don't make them any simpler than they need to be. And if you think that's dumbing it down, he also made this point, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And so I've always very much held to that perspective as being important and something that we do want to hold true. So you're going to be distilling down what you're saying. When you've written a paper and you present it, the complexity is in your paper. It's not in the presentation. To me, the presentation is to distill it down. If people are really interested, and hopefully your presentation is going to kind of dazzle them and make them interested, then they're going to want to read your paper and follow up and get the detail, get the more complex, fuller explanation. But in your presentation, it's shorter. You have less time to convey information. So the goal is to make it as simple and as clear as you can. Again, it's to communicate clearly. So the other thing that I really reflected on was the use of PowerPoint. So I'm going to just do it this way. I'm just going to share my desktop here. And so PowerPoint presentations, the thing that I've realized is that most of them suck and they have way too much text on them in a font that's too small. And they pretty much have the whole text of the presentation on them word for word. The audience really doesn't know whether to read the slides or to listen to the presentation watching you. So most likely what I found is they stop listening to you, they'll read the slide, you'll talk about it, and while you're doing that, they'll check the phone until the next slide comes on. Now, we've all sat through presentations with slide after slide after slide with bullet points, and they don't work very well. They're terrible. I see these all the time, and I gave my share of them when I was learning, and I did this teaching as well, and it's incredibly ineffective. So what I've started to do is to focus on using my slides to focus attention. So to minimize the stuff on it, but to take a much more visual kind of design. So I'm going to give you an example of something I did. So I've done research on the Green Party and the effect of the party financing rules on the sort of rise to prominence of the Green Party. So I could talk in a slide, when I'm talking about this, I'll talk about the impact of when you vote for the Green Party, it gives you money. So I have a slide like this that I'll put up. I'll put a graphic. To me, the graphics A more graphic approach is, to me, it's just it's like bolding what I'm going to say. I try to find a visual that makes the connection with what I'm saying. I want them to focus on me and what I'm saying, not look at the slide. I want them to look at the slide and have the slide reinforce things, but I really want them to listen to what I'm saying, not have their attention divided. So I started getting rid of bullet points and really focusing on graphics. I pretty much now have an entire presentation will have basically as much text as I used to cram into one slide before. So let me give you an example of the contrast. So this is one I did this fall. This is how I used to do it. I did a presentation for our department this fall that was open to the whole university community. So this is how I would have done it in the past. I was talking a bit about the digital divide, internet access and its relationship to political participation. So when I first started it, I would have done this. I would have talked about internet access is not universally distributed, that to have access to the internet, you have to have money, you have to have time to learn how to do it, you need to have technical skills, and but the problem is that factors that predict a digital divide also predict a divide in political participation. But what I do now, that's not the slide I used, that was basically what was in my notes. Here's the slide I put up while I talked about this. So I talked about the digital divide. I talked about people who have access to newer technology versus people who don't, and how that requires money and time and knowledge, and that a lot of people, and those kinds of things are also correlated with political participation. So I try to come up with visuals that are going to reinforce what I'm going to say, rather than bullet points. The thing I've learned is this basic lesson: less is more. The less you put on a slide, the better. So even when I'm doing things that are more technological, or that are summaries or conclusions, I try to distill them down to really simple, clear sentences. So we did a survey, we did a couple of surveys last year on people's digital technology skills and how they're participating politically online, and one of the big things we found is the more technologically proficient they are, the more likely they are to engage in both offline and online participation. So I had this summary slide at the end: technological skills matter. That's a key conclusion, right? I try to come up with a graphic that kind of reinforces the importance of technological skills. I'll do things if I'm talking conceptually, theoretically, right? I'll talk about the things that affect political participation: resources, opportunity, motivation. Distill it down to 3 words, and I'll show each of those words as they become relevant in the talk. Going back to talking about the Green Party, we talked about this. We talked about, in some of the research that I did with a former grad student of mine, we talked about the revenue sharing agreement that the Green Party had, and we talked about how the money could flow nationally, provincially, or to electoral district associations. And I could have written that on bullet points, but this gets the point away in a much more visually interesting way. It shows money being dispersed, which was the point that we wanted to get. So there's lots of ways you can do it, and getting to know your slideware, whether you use PowerPoint or Keynote for the Mac, those things, it's worth learning some of the things it can do besides bullet points. You'd be pretty amazed what you can pull off. Now, quantitative analysis. When you're presenting graphs and things, the goal is to simplify. So this is one that I did this fall. So I talked about people relying on television as their primary news source. When you're displaying quantitative information, the goal is to tell a story simply and to clearly communicate. So here what I really want to focus on is that younger cohorts are using television less than older cohorts, that there was a real gap between people 40 and older and people under 40 in the survey that we did when we look at what their primary news source is. So I tried to come up with a nice way to convey that information simply and clearly. Somebody can glance at that pretty quickly and figure it out, can see the point that I'm making, and then go back to listening to me. They don't have to spend a lot of time puzzling over it. So that's something I try to do. I try to do things like this when I try to talk about, this was a slide I used when I tried to talk about the different kinds of ways people access the internet. Find a graphic, find an interesting way to reinforce what you're saying rather than always using a graph, always using something different. Try to think more graphically. It works a lot better. Now, sometimes you're going to do something a little more complex. So this is from the same presentation. We did a Poisson regression and a negative binomial regression. But what I did here is, okay, this is a table right from the paper, complicated, lots of detail. I really want them to focus on this column, so I highlighted it with my presentation software and showed, okay, here's the column you need to look at. If it's above 1, that means it's positively related. If it's below 1, that means it's negatively related. So you just explain what it means, and you focus their attention. I would even sometimes even done things like fade out the other parts and just have them focus on what I want them to pay attention to. So you need to think a little bit about how you want to present your quantitative results. Again, you strip out a lot of detail. You want to focus on the high points. The key thing is to get that one big idea across. All right, I'm just going to turn off the slide, the screen share thing, and bring me back into the picture here. So just a couple of last points, things that I've seen done and things I've learned that are really, really important. So one is don't read your presentation. Really big mistake. I've seen more bad presentations, and I grill this into my students when I'm teaching this to them, is don't read your presentation out loud. The first several presentations I did, I actually wrote them completely out, but I never read them. And the reason I wrote them out is that I would learn the way I wanted to word it. When you're there presenting, especially to your first conference, it's very nerve-wracking, or if you're applying for a job and you have to do a presentation, you're going to be nervous. So the more you have the wording down and know what you want to say, even if you don't read it, you'll remember what you wrote, and you have it there as a crutch if you need it. But don't read your presentation. Biggest mistake ever. Also, you have to pay attention to whether people have read the paper. If they read the paper, you don't want to summarize all the detail because they read it. Draw their attention to the high points. What are the big things you want them to take away? So don't read. Second thing, biggest thing I can tell you, don't go overtime in a presentation. I don't think I've ever been to a presentation where somebody said, you know what, that presentation was way too short. I would have liked to hear a lot more. Usually they go plenty long, and going overtime is a big problem. So you need to get the time down. So when you're starting doing presentations, it takes a while to learn how much you can fit into the time. Practice. So I remember the job talk that I did for when I came down to for my tenure track job here at the University of Lethbridge. I was told I had 40 minutes, and then they wanted to have 10 minutes for questions and discussion. So I practiced it and practiced it, and I had it down to, first time I did it, I was at 45. I called a bunch of stuff to get it to 35 because I knew when I did it, it would take a little bit longer. And sure enough, bang, 40 minutes. I looked up at the clock, it was exactly right. I felt it was like doing a gymnastics routine and sticking the landing. I wanted to jump up and down and because I just nailed it. And that takes a little bit of practice to learn how to do that. So don't go over time. The things, so just to summarize again, the focus is communication. If you put communication first and foremost and think about how you want to structure your presentation to communicate, and if you start thinking, well, what kind of visuals, what kinds of slides will help to communicate the points clearly, you stop thinking about the presentation as an afterthought from your paper and start thinking about the presentation more as a distinct way to communicate. And what are the ways you're going to build the presentation? I spend a lot more time now preparing my presentations. I can't quick do them in the hotel the night before. I have to have them done before I go. It takes a lot of work and time. But it's made the presentations better, I think, or I'm enjoying them more. Whether other people like them more, they can decide that. But I feel a lot happier with them. So that's some of the stuff that I've learned about presentations and found. And Jared wanted me to leave lots of time for discussion. So I'll turn it over to you. Questions? Tell me things that you've seen that annoy you, or if you have great ideas that I can steal. I'm always looking to beg, borrow, and steal ideas from other people.
Well, and right on your last point, Harold, you're right on time. Exactly 20 minutes. Thanks for teeing up a good discussion here. I just want to draw on one thing, and you and I have had this discussion when it comes to teaching, but you've noted how you've moved away from texty slides into more image slides. I think a point worth reinforcing is that if you do start with texty slides, use them as your notes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Use them because the PowerPoint is great for structuring in bullet form what you would like to discuss. So you and I have traded stories about how now the courses that we used to develop, our old PowerPoint slides are now our course slides that we refer to when we're speaking, but our new slides are all images. And just
what I do now is I'll print off my old slides and I take them to class with me. They never see them. They see very different things than what I used to do. Absolutely.
Oh, but don't let your students catch you reading them. They'll ask you for those slides. Anyway, that's a little bit more on the teaching side, but there are huge parallels here, especially for students in this particular course, because they're going to be speaking to students in the same way that the professors will be. So with that, I'll ask folks that are online with us if you would like to raise a point. And again, Harold's asking for pet peeves as well. When you've seen presentations, what's gone right, what's gone wrong, any questions you might have for him, just ask you to unmute your microphone, and then I can call out your name. I'll be able to see when you unmute, and I'll point you out, and you can have the floor. I'll ask the first question to get it going, Harold. You use a lot of images. Where do you get them from?
So images, I mean, that's a big thing at first is we tend not to be trained in graphic design in grad school. So learning to find them, so it depends how scrupulously honest you want to be. If you don't really care about copyright or anything like that, then you can pretty much go to Google Images and you can find images for everything. But if you are worried about copyright, and I tend to worry about that, there's a few places I go for things like historical figures. The Wikimedia Commons is really, really good. They've got all kinds of pictures and maps and things that are all in public domain. There's some good public domain graphics websites, things like Pixabay is a really good one, and there's one that I think it's called Free Images now. It used to be called Stock Exchange. That used to be better. What's happening is a lot of these big commercial stock image firms buy the free ones and then take all the best images away. I've even used things from Flickr. Sometimes people will put images up on Flickr and they'll explicitly license them for commercial use or non-commercial use, public domain. So those are some of the places that I go pretty routinely for graphics.
I'll throw a couple more in there. Those are a great one. If you want to pay for them, if you're going to be using them a lot for either your nonprofit work or if some students are volunteers, then Dreamstime is a good one, dreamstime.com. Allfreedownload.com is another useful one. Vecteezy, VECTEEZY.com is a good one. Same thing with vectorstock.com. And if you're looking for icons and things, the Noun Project is a good one, and Icon Finder is also useful.
I'm going to be writing all those down afterwards.
Well, and that's the beauty of doing a Hangout, though, right? You can always go back and listen to it. All right, so I'll throw it open to students that might have some questions or comments. Again, things that you've seen that have worked really well in presentations and things that haven't worked so well.
So none of you have ever seen a bad or a good presentation. That's amazing.
I have a question.
Yeah, Brent.
Okay. I mean, I know that during the presentation it was mentioned that you want to try and have less text and more images kind of thing. But I'm wondering if you have any advice on, how many slides to use. Like, do you try and limit one idea per slide, or do you often try to put multiple ideas on one slide? It's just how do you manage how many slides and how many images you end up with?
That is an excellent question, Brent. Thank you. The thing that dawned on me in doing this is that so I'll back up. When I started doing presentations, we didn't have PowerPoint, right? Just to completely date myself, that was not a technology that was readily available. You'd go to conferences, and then when it started coming in, some rooms would have it, some wouldn't. So typically, what you would do is you would produce overheads that would produce your graphs and tables if you did more quantitative kinds of things, and you just talk for the rest and use that. And so you had to pay for all those overheads. PowerPoint slides are free. They cost you nothing to add more and more and more. So I'm really big on 1 point per slide, and I have lots of slides. So I did the presentation I did this fall. I talked for, I think, about 50 minutes. I had 65 PowerPoint slides. Yeah, so I go through them really quickly. They don't cost anything. So yeah, to me, 1 point per slide. I treat them like sentences or even like a paragraph. This is the one thing I want to convey with this slide, and so I try to think, okay, what's the point I want to make in my presentation? What's the slide that goes with it? How can I accentuate that one key point I want to make here? So yeah, lots of slides. I think that's the best piece of advice. And if you don't want to do lots of graphics, even just restricting the amount of text and using some different fonts and making the key points that you want to pop out based on word choice and the key phrase that you want, that even can be a lot more effective. And that doesn't take a lot of graphic design or skill. That's just a matter of stripping down your message to its essential. And I did, when I started this, I mean, I like to look for evidence at this, just not, oh, I think it would be cool to sit and do some graphics, because it's a lot of extra work. But I actually looked at some of the educational psychology research, and they find that people's recall is better if there's less on the slide. The less that's there, the more they will remember. So there actually is good research to suggest that slides that have one key point are going to be remembered much more effectively. So yeah, more slides, each of which have only 1 point. Great.
I just have a quick follow-up question. I don't know if I'm taking up too much time here.
No.
How long would you say on average then you spend per slide? Is it like a minute or less, or do you have a goal in terms of how long you sort of wait on each slide?
It depends, right? If I'm doing something like those regression analyses that I showed you, I'm going to spend a lot more time on that because there's a ton of information on there. There's way too many points. But if I'm just blowing through my conclusion, I've established all those points about technological skills matter, right? I'll highlight and just say this is one of the big conclusions of our study, is the importance of this for how people engage politically and how this has the potential to open up new divides and lack of participation because technological skills aren't evenly developed. I might be able to do that in 30 seconds. So it's really going to vary, and it actually, to me, keeps the presentation more interesting to if that varies a bit, right? Because then people don't really know what's coming. Sometimes you're going to blitz through them quickly. Sometimes you're going to go through them, spend a little more time. So it keeps them on their toes a little bit. There's this really cool format, and we've used it here at our university for some presentations. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's called Pekka Kucha, and what they do is you can actually time your slides, and I think you do 20 slides, each of which can only be on for 20 seconds. So you have to build your presentation knowing that every 20 seconds the slide is going to change. It's a really interesting disciplining thing. I've been tempted to use that for student presentations, which invariably go over time. But just the panic and chaos that would introduce to my students, I haven't done it yet, but it's in the bag of tricks I want to try at some point. So no, I vary it. Some I might spend 2 minutes on. Some I might spend as little as 10-15 seconds on. It really depends on the point I want to make.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Brett.
Megan, you had a question? Oh, Megan, we can't quite hear you. Well, we might be able to hear you now. Give it another go. No. No. You know what? If you can type me your question, Megan, I'll ask it for you. You just send it to me by email. Anybody else have any comments or questions? Becky, go ahead.
I really appreciated the point about not trying to prove how intelligent you are during your presentation and simplifying it. I was wondering if you had any advice about trying to balance that, like being able to communicate but yet still being academic at the same time. That's a pet peeve of mine, and I feel like a lot of people get caught up on it sometimes.
I agree with you. I once had, this was, I think, the nicest compliment I ever got, and this was back when I was an undergrad. I had a friend of mine who she said, I read your paper, and she said, I always wondered why you did well in school. She said, I read your paper and you made it sound so simple. Well, that's really, she said, it's so simple. Why is he doing so well? And then, but then I realized, she said, that was what made your paper so good, is that you made it simple. So to me, it's avoiding unnecessary jargon, right? We tend to use bigger words just to impress people. There's actually a really great TED Talk, and you can just search for it on the TED website. It's called Talk Nerdy to Me. And it's a communication specialist imploring scientists to use words that people can understand. So it said, why use spatial and temporal when you can talk about space and time, right? So we use all these words to puff ourselves up, but that's not very. So we want to sound really academic. There is a point. There are reasons. There are times that we do use jargon or very specific academic terms when they have a specific meaning, and other words don't do and won't communicate that effectively. So there's times where it's entirely appropriate to use very specialized language, but it's going to depend on your audience knowing what that is, and if they don't know it, you need to explain it to them. You don't want to make it so casual that you lose credibility, so using slang and joking around too much. There's a professional tone, but we use the word primary instead of main. Why? Really? They mean, in most of the ways we use them, the same thing. So I always think about what's the clearest, most simple way to communicate things. And I find that with academic writing too. I mean, there's some political scientists who I think are brilliant. I don't have a clue what they're talking about. And there are some presenters, and I'm not going to name names because this is going to be archived on the internet. There are a few people who are absolutely brilliant political scientists who I admire greatly, whose presentations in my area of research I've sat through and I have not been able to follow because they are just so needlessly complicated. To me, the really smart people, the really good people are the ones who can take complex ideas and make them understandable. So yeah, there's a balance there, but to me it's avoiding jargon unless it's necessary, right? When there are times where it is helpful, we use specific words to mean specific things because other words won't do. But I think a lot of times as social scientists, we hide behind jargon because some of the ideas we have seem kind of common sense, so we don't get cool words like thermonuclear, or we don't get lots of the jargon that natural sciences do. So I think we sometimes hide unnecessarily behind social science jargon. Does that help, or those are just my thoughts on it?
No, it's absolutely true, Harold, and it's actually it's one of my pet peeves on the practitioner side as opposed to the academic side, and that's why a lot of academics who care to speak to broader audiences are often frustrated that nobody's going to pick up their work or you know, be able to translate that into action. Like, for example, my work here in government, that's all we do is take complex ideas and boil them down not to 30-page papers but down to one-page briefing notes. Yep. So it's a really this is an opportunity for students to really hone in on those skills and make sure that you're communicating, again, back to your original point, communicating with your audience, which is the important bit.
And that's a real world skill, because you know what, if people don't understand what you're saying, your ideas are lost. I mean, if you've done research on something and you've learned something or have some great idea, the point is to get that across and show you're excited about it and show how it can solve problems or help us understand the world better. And you want them to understand that. If that doesn't come across clearly, well, people might have some idea that you're really smart, but they have no idea what you're smart about or how their ideas are useful. So yeah, I'm with you completely, Jared.
And the analogy I've heard that works quite well is you wouldn't expect a physicist to succeed if he or she couldn't do math.
Yeah.
To me, the same is true of social scientists, political scientists who can't communicate their ideas effectively. It's the language in which we speak that's important. And just put a plug in for IPAC here. I know Megan will get onto the question, but to put a plug in for IPAC, IPACimpact.blogspot.com is an example of a website that tries to push academics to take their public policy and political science research and put it into an easily digestible format. Sometimes it's called too long to read. We've always seen that hashtag TL, too long to read. This is an attempt by practitioners to try to get academics to speak in real language, so their ideas can get across. Moving on to Megan's question, whose mic isn't working. No problem, Megan.
I saw it pop up, but it vanished on me.
No, it's no problem. I got it here. Okay. She's curious if you've ever used Prezi or other programs beyond PowerPoint and had any success.
The one I use is Keynote for the Mac, and I've seen Prezi. I've seen it used a lot. I haven't used it. What I've seen a lot of these, Prezi allows you to go in different directions based on feedback when it's used well. A lot of the people I've seen use Prezi, it really is just kind of more hip version of PowerPoint the way they're using it. So if you're not going to use it effectively, I'm a huge fan of Keynote if you're a Mac user, because Keynote lets you do some really powerful graphic effects much more easily than PowerPoint. PowerPoint makes me swear repeatedly. So that's what I've used. I've seen some other ones that are cool, and often I learn about them through the Teaching Center. But no, I'm because for me, when I'm doing a presentation, it's fairly linear. I think about the organization I'm presenting, and to me, because I'm doing it linearly, I'm going to do the slides in the order that I want to. To me, the beauty of Prezi is you can mix things up based on audience feedback and go here and go there. And if you're not going to do that, then to me, Prezi is, like I said, it's just sort of PowerPoint or Keynote with jazzier transitions. But I've seen it used, and it's a neat tool, but I think it could be probably more effective for a classroom that's more discussion based, is my take on it. But anyway.
Or as an online tool. So Prezi allows you to post your presentation, and people can kind of choose their own adventure. I'm dating myself with that reference, but they're able to choose what they want to focus on when they click through your presentation as well. So it can be useful that way.
Absolutely.
Any other questions from the floor? Not seeing anybody lean in. Thank you very much for your time today, Harold. That was very, very useful.
I have one closing comment that dawned on me during this. The bar is really low when it comes to academic presentations. It really is. You just do something that's a little bit different. I did one, actually, and even just general presentations. As soon as you fire up PowerPoint, people right away just, oh no, they start to groan because they're expecting bullet points. I did a presentation after the 2012 provincial election here in Lethbridge for the community, and like 3 years later, I still have people coming up to me talking to me about it because I did graphics and I did some animation on changes in the patterns of party competition. It really stood out and was memorable to them. So the bar is really low. It's not hard to do something different and look good and to be memorable. As more and more people start actually thinking about their presentations, the bar may rise, but right now it's still pretty low. So if you do something different, you will stand out. You just have a few graphics, have less words, and you will already stand out from most people who do presentations.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much on behalf of all our students here, Harold. And if folks have any questions while they're online, feel free to post them in the comment section on YouTube, and we'll make sure that Harold gets them and has the opportunity to respond.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck with your presentations.
Thanks, Harold.
Thank you.